Shall we start? Let's wait 2 minutes. We start. Okay. So it's a big pleasure for me to introduce you Professor Stefano Lesina. He's Italian, of course, but he lives in the States and works in the States since 12 years, more or less. He got his master and PhD Parma University. Then during this period, he also visited Professor Ulanovitz in
no, la camera non la sente. Quell'altro non è che...
So he got his PhD in University of Parma. He visited as a scholar also Professor Ulanovitz, a big specialist of food web theories in Chesapeake Biological Laboratory. And then he moved in 2005 to States, doing many experience, a lot of experience as a postdoc in different University of Michigan State University, University of Michigan, UC Santa Barbara in California, and then finally arrived to University of Chicago, where he is now full professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolution, and also in the Institute of Complex Systems. So he is basically a theoretical ecologist, but with strong knowledge on complex system science, mathematical biology, and his main interests are studying large communities, dynamics of large communities, and food web theories, of course. But he's very strong in network science or in innovative approaches to manage big data set, ecological and evolutionary data set. He also is very interested also in societal issues. So he applies also his mathematical approaches to study how our societies work. For instance, the science system. So he is also an expert of science. So thank you for coming. I think his presence here was very fruitful. He's here since yesterday morning. He had a lot of exchanges with us at any level of complexity, from PhD students to senior scientists. It was a pleasure for us to have him here, and we enjoy his talk. Please.
Thank you, Domenico, for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. So today I want to talk about a series of papers or series of programs that started a bit randomly, but then grew in time. And so you will see that there are publications over almost 10 years. And this all started, when I was a PhD student, I started thinking about this problem, but it's always been a side interest. It's not the main focus of the laboratory. And before I start, I would like to thank. I have to turn this on. Yes. I would like to thank my collaborators on the papers I'm going to present. Some are professors like Jonathan, that actually now is going to move to Princeton, starting next year, but right now is technically at the Polytechnic of Zurich. And then Jacopo and Yuri were my postdocs. And then Matt was one of my students. Dan is one of my current postdocs. And Carlos is one of my current students. And Jose Capitan is a professor in Spain that every year comes to my lab for a couple of months, and we do a paper together. He's a really wonderful collaborator. And then the funding agencies, of course, that paid for this whole thing.
So one of the main foci of my laboratory is really like trying to explain like biodiversity, and especially explain like the coexistence of very many species in the same environment. And this has like analogs in other areas of biology. For example, explaining heterozygosity, like how is it maintained in a population, is a similar problem, right? So we have this problem of we see, observe empirically like very, very many things coexisting together happily, and yet we find this difficult to believe because of some mathematical results that were found very early on in the literature. And so, you know, we have about 9 million species, macroscopic species, mind you, like in the world, and in the same place we can find probably orders of tens of thousands or maybe 100,000 species in the same exact place, right? And why is this hard to believe? Because of one of the few laws in ecology, right? And this is actually the root of all of evolutionary biology, if you think, is like this principle of competitive exclusion, right? If we have two species and one is a superior competitor, we'll drive the other one extinct. And even the slightest advantage to one of the species, or imagine like we have a wild type and a mutant. If the mutant is more fit, then this allele will go to fixation, right? So like natural selection in the theory of like Darwin, it's basically a reflection of this principle, right? That if we have two things and one is better, the better one will drive the other one extinct. And in ecology, this was like proposed very early on, but like the most influential like contribution to this was this experiment by Gauss that was done in the 1920s, right? And then, you know, like he built a whole set of experiments, like, and here it's showing just like two protists competing, and when they grow in isolation, they go to some sort of asymptote, like a carrying capacity, while when they compete, their culture together, one of them drives the other one extinct, right? And so the question is, how can we have species coexisting when they're competing for the same resources, one will drive the other one extinct? So we cannot even have two. How can we have 10,000 or 100,000? And of course, like there's an obvious answer to this, and like the most accepted is this idea of some sort of niche partitioning, right? And so this is an example by Robert MacArthur that was studying warblers. It showed like that these, even though they feed on the same tree, they tend to choose different parts of the tree. So, right, we can partition the space of resources, in this case, the tree, such that we minimize competition between the different strains or the different species, and as such, we can coexist happily ever after because we don't really get in each other's way as much. And an example of this, like in evolution, is like adaptive radiation, right? So if you go to the Galapagos and you study the famous finches studied by Darwin, you can see that like they are specialized on different resources, and this is shown also in the morphology of their beaks, right? That is specialized to crack large seeds, small seeds, the cactus, like the insects, etc., etc. So you partition the space of resources, and so then we can have order of 16 species coexisting in the same place because they partition the resources to avoid competition. This theory is very beautiful, and we have had very many like wonderful results based on this. We can use this to make predictions, right? Like, so that's what makes biology a science, that we can make predictions that then we can test experimentally. The trouble is that it doesn't work very well when we're looking at the highly speciose ecosystem. So this is a picture, for example, of the Amazon rainforest. And there's three things that I would like you to take from this picture, but two you can see, one you cannot see, so I will have a further slide for that. So the first thing I want you to notice is that trees grow everywhere, right? There's no space that is empty of trees, right? So like you can fit as many trees as you can fit, and that's the number that is given here, right? That's number one. The second thing that is slightly more difficult to see, especially if you're sitting far away, is that all these trees have the same height. Why do you think they have the same height? Because they compete very strongly for light, right? So light is a very limiting factor in this kind of tropical rainforest. There's like this canopy that is basically another environment where, in fact, very many other species live. And so like the dynamics of this forest is that some tree dies, and then it opens a gap in the canopy. This gap is then filled by another tree, right? The third thing that you cannot really appreciate from this picture, but it's very important, is that there's a lot of species of trees in the Amazon rainforest. In fact, like the Amazon has about 400 billion trees, right? So that's a very, very large number. But what is even more amazing is that there are estimated, we don't really know how many species of trees there are, of course, but we estimate to be about 16,000 species of trees coexisting in the system. And it's interesting also because like there is a very, very skewed distribution of abundances such that 227 species make up about half of the total, so 200 billion trees. And then all the other species are very rare, right, with different levels of rarity that form this sort of power law, right, that you can see here. And so now it's hard to believe that trees that are fundamentally doing whatever trees do, right, they need like water, light, some phosphorus, nitrogen, and a few other cofactors and whatnot, could possibly partition these resources into 16,000 pieces, right, to avoid competition. So that is where this kind of theory is a bit problematic, right? And that's why, you know, we have the same problem with plankton. You know, how many species of plankton can you get in a glass of seawater or things like this, right? And so this is a very common problem in biology, and there have been various attempts to try to explain how is this diversity generated in the first place and maintained in the second. And today I would like to illustrate a theory of this maintenance of biodiversity that is based on a children's game, that is the rock, paper, scissors. Why is this a fitting exercise? Because like if you think of rock, paper, scissors, imagine that we have three species of tree, one that is the rock species, one that is the paper species, one that is the scissor species. They cannot coexist in pairs, right? Because if you have only rock and paper, paper will drive the rock extinct. If you have only rock and scissor, you know, rock will drive the scissors extinct and whatnot. But because they form this sort of intransitive loop of competitive exclusion, they cannot coexist together, right? And you don't have to trust me that this can happen because there actually are examples in nature that you can find of rock, paper, scissors. There's not very many, but I'm gonna put like my favorite two. One is like this paper that was, I think, in 1996 in Nature by Sinervo and Lively. So they studied like these side blotch lizards, and these lizards come in three morphs that for ease are called orange, blue, and yellow. And these are like the males, have these three different morphs, and they visited several islands, and they always found either the three morphs living together or only one of the morphs. They never found two. Why is that? Because it's exactly like in the rock, paper, scissors, right? These three have different mating strategies, and when they're present like together, each one has an advantage over one other strategy and loses against one of the strategies. But when there's only two, one wins. And that's why you find either one of the morphs or three morphs. Another more like experimental approach to this was this paper by Benjamin Kerr and other people like at Stanford in 2002. Here they have three strains of E. coli, of bacteria, but they produced they engineered like two of these strains. So we have a wild type that is this colicin-sensitive type that is sensitive to an antibiotic. And then they insert a plasmid that produces the antibiotic in another strain. So then the one that produces the antibiotic would drive extinct the sensitive strain. And then they put another plasmid that causes like resistance to antibiotic in a third strain. So this one would exclude the one producing the antibiotic. And so these three, when they're put in space such that like the antibiotic cannot disperse freely in like a liquid medium, then they chase each other. And so you can see this experimentally exactly like you would expect mathematically of these blotches like moving around like your petri dish, right? So that's a beautiful example of that. Of course, these are like rock, paper, scissors as what? Three species. So this is a fantastic theory for explaining how can we see three species together but not 17. Is there a way to extend this game of rock, paper, scissors to more than three strategies? Of course there is, and in fact, like if you've seen like the Big Bang Theory or something like that, we will have examples where you can actually buy a t-shirt with rock, paper, scissors, lizard, and Spock, and we're going to see that game in a second. Before we go there, I just wanted to say a few words on game theory such that everybody's on the same page. So like game theory is like what? There's players playing a game and they have strategies, right? In this case, like of rock, paper, scissors, they have three pure strategies, meaning like rock, paper, or scissors. And they can either play a pure strategy, so if they play 100%, say, rock, or 100% of the time scissor, or they can play a mixed strategy. A mixed strategy is simply a probability, like on the different pure strategies, such that they sum to one, right? So I could play rock, paper, scissors with the strategy sigma, saying I play 10% of the time I play rock, 50% of the time I play paper, and 40% of the time I play scissors. right? So imagine that we have two players playing the game. They independently choose one strategy from their bag of mixed strategies, and then they play, and then there's somebody winning and somebody losing. And this winning and losing is encoded in this matrix on the right that is called the payoff matrix. Basically, if you play rock and I play scissor, I lose, I give you $1, right? So you will get a payoff of 1, and I get a payoff of -1. The fact that the number of dollars is constant means that this game is zero-sum, right? So the total amount of money is fixed, and then all that matters is what proportion of money do you have or do I have? And the game is, in this case, symmetric. So whatever I win, you lose, and whatever you lose, I win. So this is the simplest kind of matrix game. This was studied very extensively by Morgenstern and other people that founded game theory. And then a very interesting question is there a better way? Is there a best way to play this game? Is there a strategy that is the best strategy to play, right? And like the answer came in 1950 by a very, very short paper. I don't know if you've ever seen how short this paper is. It's like maybe half a page in PNAS by John Nash in 1950. John Nash of A Beautiful Mind fame, really interesting character, but like he had this very early on during his PhD, he had this breakthrough that defined what is called now a Nash equilibrium. So we have a non-comparative game, like a game in which like we have, say, zero sum, and then a Nash equilibrium is simply a situation in which players play a certain strategy, and they have nothing to gain in changing their strategy. Irrespective of what the other opponent does, they want to stick with their strategy because it's the best strategy to play. And what Nash was able to prove is that every game that has a finite number of players, most games do because there's only a finite number of people on Earth, and then a finite number of pure strategies, for example, rock, paper, scissors, we have only 3 strategies, has at least one Nash equilibrium. That is like his claim to fame, and it's a very important result. In the rock, paper, scissors, you might know, since you were children, the best possible strategy is to play at random each one of the strategies, right? So you would put like an optimal strategy is playing 1/3 each strategy, right? As I was saying, like this is very boring, like to play rock, paper, scissors, like our children do it. You can spice this up by having multiple strategies. For example, this is like the rock, paper, scissors, lizard, and Spock, where I think this is lizard and this is Spock, right? And this has 5 strategies, and the best strategy is to play each one 1/5 of the time. Big deal. And then if you search on the internet, you can find the rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock, Spider-Man, Batman, wizard blog, right? For example, that has 9 strategies. But in fact, today I'm going to show you how you can entertain your friends by inventing your own game, right? You can invent any game with 2 k+1 strategies. So it has to be an odd number of strategies, right? So imagine that in this case, k is 3, so we have a 7 strategies game of rock, paper, and scissors. How do you build this? It's very simple. You take one node, right? Imagine the red node, and you say this node loses against the previous half of the nodes, and wins against the next half of the nodes, right? So you will lose against 3, you will win against 3. And then you repeat this for all the nodes, and you get like a wonderful game with 7 things. You can name it yourself. The first 3 have to be rock, paper, scissors, but after that you can choose whatever you like. And the best strategy that you can use to play this game is to just play 1/7 of the time each strategy. So it's not a super interesting game. It can get very complicated when you have like 13 or 15 strategies. Also, like because there's a finite number of, signs that you can make with your hands. Maybe you need 2 hands after a while. But I'm going to show you how to build an even more interesting game, right? So imagine that we take rock, paper, scissors, and then we take the node here in red that is like, I don't know, paper, and we substitute that with another rock, paper, and scissors. Right? So we will substitute these with 3 nodes that they all lose. For example, to the green, all win against the blue, but they rock, paper, scissors within them, right? So by doing this, we have this kind of a tournament game, right? And here, what is interesting about this is that now the best strategy is not to play each and every strategy with the same probability, but rather you should play the blue and the green with 1/3 probability and the other one only with 1/9 probability, right? So this basically tells us that we can have distributions of probabilities that are not uniform in the optimal strategy. And so like with these 2 rules that I show, you can surprise your friends by building these regular games like rock, paper, scissors, in which there's always an odd number of strategies that you should play. The optimal strategy is to play each one of them with probability 1 over the number of strategies. But you can build more interesting games where we take like one node out of this graph and we substitute with another game, right? And so we can build like things where we can have almost any distribution of probabilities on the optimal strategy that we can like. Right? These games, notice, will always yield an odd number of strategies, right? Because if I take out one from an odd number and then I add another odd number, it's still odd, right? This is a bit of a quirky part of these models. But then, we can make even more interesting games, like in rock, paper, scissors or other things like that. One strategy always beats the other, but what if it were to beat the other with probability 80%, 20%, or whatnot? If we extend this, we can, of course, build more complex games. And in fact, what is interesting is that for any possible set of strategies, like a mixed strategy, any vector that sums to 1, we can build a game such that that is the optimal strategy for the game. And this would be important in a second. All right, this is all the game theory that you need to understand the following. So I'm going to have a theme and then 2 variations on this theme. And so the first part is like based on a paper that I've had with Jonathan. This is stuff that I did during my postdoc and then published because it took forever when I was a professor already. But the idea is to extend this rock, paper, scissors to very many interacting strategies and treat each strategy as a species. And to do that, what I'm going to introduce is like the idea of this zero-sum forest. This is like a forest like the tropical rainforest that I showed you before, but it's a bit magical, right? Because it has 2 features that are almost true in an actual forest, but not quite. The first one, which I think is not too bad, is that there's a fixed number of trees. And if I showed you before, like this picture, that all the trees that you can pack in a square kilometers are there, then it means that one tree dies, one tree will take its place, but not 15, right? So the total number of trees in the Amazon rainforest is about constant, at least we're not disturbing it too much. And so that's not a bad idea. What is a little more magical, I think, is that when a tree dies, like here we have one tree dying, and then we have to see who's going to germinate and fill this gap. What we're going to assume is that this is just proportional to the number of trees of each species in the system, so that basically each species produces a number of seeds. We put all these seeds in the bag, and then we're going to pick one of these seeds at random and plant it there. That's what's going to fill the gap, right? So this is basically the same thing as removing space, which as a theoretician you can totally do and get away with it, but in theory only, because in practice there is going to be space such that if you have trees close by of a certain species, it's more likely to get seeds from that species. All right, and then the tree grows, and then we're back to the same number of trees that we had before, right? So constant number of trees meaning zero sum, right? If the proportion of trees of a certain species goes up, it means that something else has to go down, right? Because it's zero sum. And then this fact that we're just taking seeds and then we're planting the seed, depending on the density of the species. So because of the number of seeds the number of trees being fixed, we can just track relative abundance. So we call xi like the proportion of trees of species I in the forest. And these proportions, of course, sum to 1, because that's what proportions do. And then we have 3 processes that are important. One is like a death. So imagine what is the lifespan of this tree, right? It will die at a certain rate, right, depending on their average lifespan. And so I'm going to call this d of I is like the death rate, or like 1 over the lifespan of species I. And so this is the rate at which they die. And because we have a certain proportion of trees of species I, then the rate at which we deplete the proportion of species I will be the product of these 2 numbers. And then, of course, we have a birth term, right? Like this, you can think of fecundity, right? So maybe some trees make a lot of seeds, some trees make fewer seeds, and because we're just sampling one seed at random, the identity of the seed that we pick, for example, probability of picking a seed I will be proportional to the product between the density of the species and the number of seeds each or one of these trees produces. Finally, the most interesting part is where you introduce competition, right? So imagine that I take these 2 seeds and put them in the pot, and then let them grow. They compete for resources. One of them will fill the gap in the canopy, the other one will not. Who wins? Right, so I'm going to call Hij the probability that I beats J when they're competing in pairs, right? And Hji, the probability that J wins. And these 2 must sum to 1, right? Because somebody's got to win no matter what, right? So we have the very particular structure in which Hij plus Hji equals to 1, and this is what graph theory is called a tournament game. All right, so that's all we need. And so initially what we're going to assume is that like we have our trees, one tree dies, and what we're going to do is we're going to pick 2 seedlings from the bag of seeds, right? We pick 2 seeds and we plant them. And then we see who grows, and then we update the system like that, right? So it's a very simple. A tree dies, picks 2 seedlings from the pool of all the seeds that are available right now, compete the first with the second, whoever wins fills the gap and increases its density, and the other one will decrease its density. All right, so because like we like to keep things simpler, we can set all the fertilities to be about the same, so we set them all to 1, and the death rates to be all 1, so now we're thinking of seeds or trees of about the same species or like closely related species. And then we assume, of course, that there's very, very many individuals so that we don't have to take care of stochastic fluctuations and whatnot. Then we can write a differential equation, which is kind of simpler to manage, and this is the form, but I'm going to show you like the form in more detail for a rock, paper, scissors. So imagine that we have 3 species of plants, like the rock species, the paper species, and the scissor species. And they have this probability of winning that's encoded in the matrix A, so H, so for say, paper always beats rock, scissor never beats rock, right? And when you're competing rock and rock, one of the 2 will win with probability 50% because they're identical, so it's just like the flip of a fair coin. And so these equations become very easy to interpret in this case because R squared is what? The probability they sample 2 rocks from the bag, it's R squared. And then a rock also increases when they sample a rock and a scissor, which can happen in 2 different ways, so that's why there's a 2 in front. And then there's the death rate of the rock, that is minus R, right? That's like how often do these things die. And the similar equations are for all the other species, right? And what is remarkable is that then you can simplify this picture quite a bit by writing this other equation that is called the Replicator Equation in evolutionary game theory. And it's basically encoding this payoff matrix that I showed you before. Instead of saying what is the probability this one wins, we take the probability of winning minus the probability of losing, and then we get like something where the entries of Pij plus Pji is equal to 0, right? And this is equivalent to taking like the matrix H that I showed you before minus its transpose. This is a very important equation in evolutionary game theory. It was pioneered by Hofbauer and Sigmund in the 1970s. Martin Nowak and other people really brought this to the fore of evolutionary biology, and it's been used to do a lot of research in the evolution of cooperations and other things. This is probably the simplest equation that you can write in this form. So this is how the equation becomes when we use this notation with P, with the payoff matrix, and so you can see that you have 0 in the diagonal now, and then you have 1s and minus 1s. And the equations are considerably simpler. We don't have this square term anymore. And now we can think of the dynamics of this. So the dynamics are a bit funny, right? So if we start with rock, paper, and scissors, and we track the proportion of individuals of any of the 3 strains or like species in time, you can see that they oscillate regularly, exactly as you would in the Lotka-Volterra model, the original 1925-1926 model. And if you were to take the average of these time series, you would find what is called the optimal strategy for this game, right? So they oscillate about the optimal strategy of the game, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So if you were to start the system exactly at 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, they will stay there. If you move it a little bit, they will have small oscillation. If you move it a lot, they will have wide oscillations. So this is what is called neutral stability. Then we can do this with more complicated models, right? Here we have, for example, 5 species, and like the shade means like how likely is this to be the other. And we have about the same behavior. For any initial conditions and any system that we can build, a certain number of species will go extinct fairly rapidly. In this case, the green and the blue go extinct fairly rapidly. And then the remaining species will oscillate up and down, exactly as in the rock, paper, scissors. Of course, they could be oscillation with a different number of species. In this case, it's still 3, but you can do this with any number of species that you like. So this is a more complicated example where we have still 5 species, and you can see these complex cycles arising, and these all coexist happily ever after in these cycles. All right, so just like to recap these parts, for any game that you can concoct, like any relationship of like a competition between any 2 species under this model, Some species will rapidly go extinct and they're out of the picture. The remaining species will cycle up and down neutrally, like in Lotka Volterra. And what they cycle about is the optimal strategy for the game. If we choose, and this I didn't show, but it's kind of fun. If I choose this game at random, right? So imagine that I just draw this Hij, this probability of winning from a uniform distribution. Then what happens is that I can integrate these dynamics, about half of the species will coexist. So the expectation is that if I start with 100 species, I will end up with 50 species, which means that if I start with 32,000 species, I will end up with 16,000 species, which was my goal to begin with, right? To explain how can we have 16,000 species of trees coexisting. So we can have as many species as we like. The trouble is that if you follow like this thing, first, turns out that all trees are different. Like, that's why we call them species in the first place. So they will have intrinsically different death rates and different fertilities. And also, we don't really see this thing oscillating up and down. We see them pretty constant, right, in time. At least since we started measuring, they haven't been oscillating a lot. So what happens if we mildly perturb this, this constant such that instead of being constant death rate for every species or constant fertility for every species, what happens if we add, a little bit of noise? And what happens is something really bad. This whole thing bursts into flames in the sense that like this oscillation, instead of being constant, now they increase, which means that eventually one of the species will go extinct. Then, because this is a rock, paper, scissors, a second species will go extinct immediately after, and then we end up with one species. So much for a nice theory killed by an ugly fact, right? So that's bad. And this is true for any configuration, right? So whenever you change these kind of parameters, then you have the theory is not robust. And a theory that is not robust, I think, for biology is completely useless, right? Because things are not fine-tuned in biology. When we're saying that this is a certain fertility, fertility of the square root of 2 divided by pi, it's not true in the mathematical sense, right? We're saying that there's a variation within the individual life history of one individual will have many more seeds at the beginning, and later maybe they will have fewer. If we take 2 individuals of the same species, they have a different number of seeds. If we take like the same species in space, in time, in whatever you want, we see variation. So a theory that cannot account for small modifications of the parameters and then burst into flames like this one, it's not a good theory for biology. Right. So here comes variation number 1. This variation number 1 is like on higher order interactions, and there is like a review that we did last year in Nature, in which we talk about like all the mechanisms that could promote coexistence that can only be observed for more than 2 species. And this is kind of interesting because if you think like when we think of coexistence theory, like even the work of Chesson or other people, what we're thinking is we've looked very, very carefully at 2 species competing. It's always 2, right? And the same is true for like the theory of evolution. We're always thinking of a wild type and a mutant, right? And things like that. We're really enamored of the number 2, like in the sense that we do like the wild type and the mutant, the predator and the prey, the 2 competitors, the parasite and the host, like the susceptible and the infected. We have had like a lot of 2s in biology from a very long time. And there's some things that you simply cannot happen with 2 species. For example, this intransitive competition can only appear when we have at least 3, right? And then they carry forward. The second paper is instead like what I'm going to present today. It's like this idea of what if instead of interacting in pairs, species were to interact in triplets or quadruplets and whatnot. What happens then? And so like the setting is exactly like before, but instead of picking 2 seeds at a time, when we want to fill a gap, we pick 3 seeds. And then we compete the first with the second, and then we have a winner. And then whoever is the winner compete with the third, right? So we're doing this kind of tournament in which you advance to the next stage and then you have to beat the other species. Okay? All the rest is exactly the same. And so using exactly the same math, you can write equations. Now they're a little uglier, right, in the sense that you have to account for all the possible ways of picking 3 species, which are like 6 instead of being like only 2. And so you get a little more like of these HIJs, HJI, and whatever, right? But these are all the pairwise interactions that you need. And just to make an example with the rock, paper, scissors as before, now like we increase the number of rocks when we either pick 3 rocks, which happens with probability r cubed, or we pick 2 rocks and 1 scissor, which is r squared s, And there's 3 ways to do that, so that's the 3 in front, 1 rock and 2 scissors, or of the 6 ways that you can pick rock, paper, scissors in whatever order that you like, 2 of them will lead eventually to rock winning if we do this kind of sequential competition. And then the death term is as before. Right? Before we were able to transform this into a replicator equation, right, in which things happen by mass action like in pairs. It turns out that you can do the same here. But instead of having a matrix of interaction, because now we are interacting in triplets, what we have is called a tensor. It's a 3-dimensional matrix of interactions. And what is remarkable about this is that you can see on the right-hand side we have like the product of 3 densities. So whenever we have the product of 3 different densities of species I, J, and K, it's when we call higher order interactions. So these higher order interactions have been thought of like for forever, basically, right? Because why should things interact in pairs? Just because we can write a matrix or because we can draw the phase plane on a blackboard that is 2-dimensional? That's not like a good reason, right? So we just do it out of mathematical convenience, but we can think of plenty of examples where things do not really interact in pairs. My favorite example that I mentioned this morning to the PhD student is like work of my postdoctoral advisor, Scott Picker. What he did, he studied tadpoles feeding on algae in like mesocosms. And then he introduces a predator like this larva of the dragonfly that eats like the tadpoles. And of course, this has an effect because it eats them, right? Okay, so we can think of this as a tree-trophic food chain. But like a tree-trophic food chain is basically a coupling of 2 pairwise interactions. But here's the twist. You take the same like predator, these anax-like larvae, put them in a bag such that they cannot get out, but can be still smelt by the tadpoles. And what happens is that the tadpoles change their behavior, right? They hide most of the time. They eat lower quality food. And so basically the presence of the 3rd species, like of the predator, only by its virtue of the presence, not because of their direct effect by eating the tadpoles, changes the behavior of the tadpoles and therefore modifies the pairwise interaction that we had before. Which means that like a tree-trophic food chain, when we have behavior in the middle part, is not a coupling of 2 pairwise things anymore. It's really a triplet, right? So these kind of higher order interactions have been of interest to ecologists for a very long time. And yet, no one knew generically what is the effect that we might expect from these higher order interactions. All right, so what is the effect? This is like the case for rock, paper, scissors. By the way, one thing that is kind of fun is that there is an international federation of rock, paper, scissors players. And they have rules to play rock, paper, scissors with 3 players. And if we do our math, we get exactly the same rules to play rock, paper, scissors with 3 players. In case you're interested, like when you're playing with 3 players, exactly as when you play with 2, maybe everybody plays the same strategy. Imagine everybody plays rocks, then no one wins. Differently from the pairwise case, when we have 3 people, maybe 1 person plays rock, 1 paper, 1 scissors, in which case, again, no one wins, right? Because I would give you $1, you would give the other person $1, the other person would give you $1 back, so 0. So the only 2 interesting cases really are when there's 2 players playing one strategy and 1 player playing the other, right? And so if the 2 players play the losing strategy and the winner plays the winning strategy, gets $2, that's the 2 over there. If, however, we have 1 loser and 2 winners, they split the winning, and so they get $0.50. And that's the 1/2 over there. So that's how you play rock, paper, scissors. Now we can extend this to any number of strategies in any game, right? You can find what are the rules to play with 3 people. So the equations are considerably simpler, but what is remarkable about this is not really like that we can write this in higher order interaction, is that this higher order interaction dramatically modify the behavior of the system. Right? Before we had these kind of neutral oscillations when we had like seeds competing in pairs. When we have seeds competing in triplets, the same equilibrium holds as before. So in this case of rock, paper, scissors, 1/3 each, but it becomes attractive, right? So like whenever you start from any condition, it will oscillate with damped oscillation and will eventually converge to the equilibrium. And this is globally stable. So starting from any initial condition, you will end up in the same place. So this got rid of one of the bad features of the model, right? That was that we had these neutral oscillations that we didn't really observe in nature. And the same holds for any system that you can come up with, like a certain number of species go extinct, the other one oscillate, but with damped oscillation and eventually converge to an equilibrium. And these are the same examples as I had before, but you can see that now all of them converge. So as before, some species go extinct, but the remaining species, instead of cycling neutrally, they approach rapidly the equilibrium, and the equilibrium is given by the optimal strategy of the game as before. And so if we choose the game at random, half of the species coexist, and therefore we can have as many species as we want, coexisting happily ever after. So it's a slightly better theory. The second thing that this should solve is the problem of the parameters. Before we had that as soon as we changed the parameters a little bit from being all identical to anything else, this burst into flames. So now we should do the test again, right? So what happens if I now change the parameters? Nothing much, right? So this is a robust theory. We can choose like the parameters, however we see fit, and we still have the same qualitative behavior, even though, of course, the equilibrium will not be exactly the same because there's this balancing of fertilities and death rates. Okay, now, if we go from 2 to 3, we have this dramatic change in the behavior of the dynamical system. What if I choose 5 or 17 species at a time, and they compete the first with the second, the winner with the third, the winner with the fourth, with the winner, etc., etc. What do I end up with? The same dynamics, but now I have a k-dimensional, matrix of payoffs. But does it do anything to the dynamics? And the answer is no. It doesn't do almost anything. So when we sample 3 seeds, we approach the equilibrium. Imagine like at about 300, we're at the equilibrium, 300 time units. When we put 4 seedlings, we go to the same exact equilibrium, but now we go there in, say, 200 or 150 time units. And if we put 5, we go there in 100 time units. So it just goes faster. It doesn't change qualitatively the result. So it turns out that we had chosen the only number of seedlings, and we studied this for a very long time, the only number of seedlings for which this doesn't happen is 2. Right? So we were lucky that for 100 years we studied the only pathological case of this mode. Right. So the conclusion for this first variation are that we can have very many species coexisting when they play a game like rock, paper, and scissors. When they compete in triplets, quadruplets, and whatnot, because coexistence is both stable, because this is globally stable, an attractive point, and robust, right? Which is the most important feature of a biological model, that we can change a little bit the parameters, and we only change the results a little bit. We don't change them dramatically. And what is cool about this, and I think that that's why we were able to generate interest in this model, is that it involves these higher order interactions, right? The species including like a higher order in a sense, like the presence of the species rock can modify the outcome of the interaction between the paper and the scissors, right? Depending on where this is placed. All right, but the higher order interactions are fun, I love them dearly, but as far as I can tell, no one knows whether they're prominent in nature or not, right? No one has really tried to measure them properly. Variation number 2 deals with another case in which instead we have plenty of evidence that this is important, right? And this is the idea of interspecific variability. All these different frogs that unfortunately you cannot see very well, they're very beautiful, are all the same species, even though they have completely different looks. This is like about to speciate, so it's a bit of an extreme case, but like you can find very different morphologies, very different phenotypes within the same species, and we find this all the time. And why this arises, it's fairly obvious. But what does it do to dynamics? It's not obvious at all, right? So like this paper with Dan Miner and the collaborators, we're trying to see what happens when we introduce phenotypic diversity in the same type of model. That's why it's a variation on the same theme. And the way I want to picture this is like, before we looked above ground, right? These trees look of different species, but what if we look below ground? And for the same species, some have long roots, some have like short roots and whatnot, right? So if we have variability. Then what we had before is like the probability that yellow beats blue as one probability is in fact like it has to be expanded. And it's the probability that this certain phenotype of yellow beats the certain phenotype of blue, right? So if you think of a matrix, before we had just like one value for each one of these things, and now we have 2 phenotypes of the same species, 3 phenotypes of the other species, and they all have slightly different probabilities of winning against each other, right? So we expand this system to have multiple phenotypes, right? And the other thing that we want to introduce is some notion of phenotypic memory. This we think mostly of in terms of phenotypic plasticity, but you can imagine with which fidelity are phenotype reproduced, right? So if I'm a phenotype A and I produce offspring, with which probability does the offspring have the same phenotype that I have versus another phenotype that is present in the species, right? And this you can think of like some sort of like how plastic is this phenotype or not. And so we will call Q the probability that you produce an offspring with the same phenotype that you have, and 1 minus Q is the probability you produce another phenotype, if we have only 2. And so basically now we have a slightly more complicated picture, right, in which we have species that are here represented by color. Within each species we have phenotype that are represented by the different shades of color, right? So we have 3 phenotypes here, 2 here, 1 here, and 4 here. And then we have a matrix of phenotypic memory, right? This matrix Q that says with which probability, if I am a phenotype, say of the first piece, the orange one, do I produce somebody with my phenotype or the other phenotype, right? So this has some sort of blocks, and you can see like it's 2 by 2 for the species with 2 phenotypes, 3 by 3 for the one with 3 phenotypes that is here, and this one is represented here 4 by 4, right? What is the probability that if I have phenotype whatever, I produce the other phenotype? And then again, we have like this matrix H that says what is the probability that I win or lose against any other phenotype in the population. And what is interesting is that before we had an equation that mapped into the replicator equation, and this, after some massaging that I'm going to gloss over because it would be boring and long, and it's already 5 to 1, it maps into what is called the selection mutation equation, which is exactly how evolutionary game theorists study inheritance of genotypes, right? So that you have mutation and you can move in this space of mutations and then give rise to different wild types, right? And so the equations are slightly more complicated, but by and large map into whatever we had before. Before we had basically that this matrix Q would be the identity matrix, right? And each one would have only one phenotype. So like one example, just to show this, it's like imagine that we have rock, paper, and scissors, but every so often rock produces a maladapted rock, like something that just doesn't come out as nicely. And this new maladapted rock loses to everybody, right? Because it's just like it's infertile or whatever it is. It just like loses against everybody else. So before we had neutral cycling, right, when we didn't have this maladapted rock, what happens if we have the maladapted rock? And what happens is that the maladapted rock stays in the population at very low density because it can only be replenished by this generation, like this phenotypic like infidelity, like in which like phenotype good rock produces the bad rock. But what it does to the rest of the community is that it stabilizes all the dynamics, right? Which is kind of remarkable if you think of like population genetics as we've been taught for like 100 years, is that if we have a wild type and a mutant and the mutant is not very good, it will just be wiped away quite quickly, right? But this is because we assume that the rest of the system is exactly still, right? That it's not moving. While if the rest of the system responds to the presence of the maladapted genotype or phenotype, then we could have more interesting dynamics. Anyway, I don't want to get too philosophical here, but what I want to show you is that this is true in general, right? As soon as we introduce some sort of variation, we get this kind of stabilization of the dynamics, and the effect is strongest when we can think of this as like as these models of moving 2 different axes. One of these is like how strong is phenotypic memory? Do you tend to produce offspring with your same phenotype or not? And the other one is how different are the phenotypes from each other in terms of like how they compete with the other species, right? And you can imagine the maximum of diversity is obtained for what? When phenotypic memory is quite strong, right? So that you tend to produce phenotypes with your own kind with high fidelity, and the similarity is very low, right? So these phenotypes have very, very different properties. So they practically act as different species, right? And you can do some analysis of this, which I'm not going to get into because I just want to conclude and take questions. So the conclusion of this part is that phenotypic variation, which we know, contrary to higher order interactions, that is widespread in nature, can still promote coexistence and stabilize dynamics in these ecological communities. And what we see, phenotypic variation is typically justified in evolutionary theory as a bad hedging strategy because we don't know the conditions in the future. We produce a variety. We diversify our portfolio as we would for our stock market or whatever other thing in order to have the possibility of creating a good, well-adapted phenotype for the future, right, as opposed to right now. But what is interesting here is that we can do this bad hedging at a community-wide level. And these stabilizing effects turns out to be strongest when phenotypes are inherited with high fidelity and differ substantially from each other in competitive abilities. And just to wrap up like this whole thing, what I showed you is like a series of theories in which no pair of species can coexist in isolation, so we can never have two species coexisting in this model. But thanks to this kind of competitive networks, right, that is spreading around in these different species, we can have widespread, robust, and stable coexistence. And this pathological neutral cycling that I showed you before, that then is very fragile and whatnot, just disappears whenever we do any modification of this model. And here I showed you only two, but there's at least another two that we found recently that do exactly the same trick. So this seems to be sitting at an edge of all the possible models. That is the only edge that is pathological. And what is cool about this system is that these days we get a lot of data on relative species abundance. For example, if we're doing studies of microbiomes and whatnot, we cannot really estimate like the load of bacteria quite nicely, but we can get the relative abundance quite easily by sequencing, right? So we're in a world where this kind of being on a simplex, like having proportions that sum to 1, is becoming more and more interesting. So if we wanted to track the dynamics of, say, microbiome after you take antibiotics, what happens to your bacterial communities, this type of model is very well suited for that, right? Because we're already modeling proportions. And so just this is like the bibliography in case you want to read anything more. This paper is in review for forever, so I can send you a copy of that if you're interested in reading it. Hopefully we will get reviews soon, and hopefully they better be positive, given that we've been waiting for so long. And thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Stefano, for this illuminated talk. Really. Yes. Meno a dirlo.
Intuitive question. Do you see a link between these maladaptive phenotypes and the Powerlaw distribution of species in a community?
Right. So the question is whether like the fact that there are some maladaptive species that would stay at very, very low abundances could be, you know, like due to this kind of maladapted phenotype. I would not like guarantee that that's the case, but it would certainly be the case if we had like maladaptive, they would stay at very low abundance. That's for sure. But like, I have never thought like of how would you get a power law out of this. So I'm still not sure. That's a good question.
Any other?
What's the role? Thank you for all first because it was a very interesting explanation. Processes like immigration or movement of these species that obviously change the number of species in a different time scale. Are these processes considered in these theories?
Yes. Yeah, so here they're not considered at all. We're considering a fixed pool of species, and there's no new species coming in or coming out. This type of thing can be extended to having like immigration and even like having assembling this community. So I didn't talk about this, but if you go in this paper, like in the supplement, we have like the simulations that do exactly like that, right? Because if we cannot even have two species, how can we build, for example, diversity from the ground up? I was worried that, you know, we would have one species, then we put a second, one of the two persists, and then we're done, right? Like, and we can never get to 3. So how can we build this up? So we did exactly the model that you're saying, right? In which we have a certain rate at which new species arrive into the system, and the species establish, for example, random interactions with the resident species, and then we can see whether we can build up like communities. And what is interesting that I didn't think, but then, you know, like this simulation taught me, like this, is that we can take two species that are very similar, and it's true that one will eventually drive the other one extinct, but it will take a very long time, right? So if you have something that is there. Now you put something that is slightly better there. These two species will coexist for a very long time, a sufficiently long time to allow the invasion of a third species. And so what you can see is that you can build up this community to an arbitrary number of species. And what is really remarkable is that the prediction of the simulations match exactly the neutral theory of biodiversity, in which it's assumed that these species do not interact at all, right? And it's like favored also in population genetics, like by the work of Kimura, and in ecology by Hubble. And the main fantastic feature of this neutral theory, which is bad on so many levels and it's made people like mad on so many levels because species do interact, thank you very much, and they're all different, thank you very much. That's why we study biology in the first place. Linnaeus knew that these species were all different. Is that, but like what is good is like there's three features. First, this is a mathematically tractable theory, which is great, right? Because we can make predictions and then see the data, what they are. And second, it produces like species abundance distributions that match those that we see empirically. And third, you know, it has this build-up of communities that is quite natural, right? And so we showed that like by just not assuming that species do not interact, but by assuming that they interact at random. So these are very strong interactions, but they're just like randomly established. You get exactly the same results, which I think it's an interesting point.
Yep. I have a little question, maybe that could be interesting to link to Graz's one. What if a species escapes competition temporarily by producing like resting stages? So you have disappears, no competition, then appears again.
Yes, that is a model that we want to do, but we haven't done. I think the same thing will happen, but it's difficult just to do the mathematics of it.
I can imagine that your models are also sort of space dependent. If you compare a large rainforest, there's of course lots of interactions going on in very different places, and then the outcome summed is predictable. But if you play the game in smaller spaces, like in a bioreactor, then what happens is that things interact for some time, and then suddenly the system flies out of control.
Yes. So there's in fact, there's three things. First, like I didn't consider space at all because I'm not really good with partial differential equations, so I don't want to do space. Maybe somebody that is better than I am can do that in space, and I'm sure that they would be much more interesting behavior of the system. For example, we know that we could have things moving in space, like patches of things chasing each other in a rock, paper, scissors, and I'm not doing any of it. So this is, you can think of this as bacteria in a well-shaken medium, right? And I'm saying bacteria for a second point, which is this is only holding this kind of differential equation when we have a very large number of individuals. When we have smaller, like a finite number of individuals, then the outcome is always the extinction of everybody, right? But the time to extinction, and that's what we do also in the supplement of this paper, the time of to extinction changes dramatically when we have these higher order interactions. So without the higher order interactions, we have that it's linear in the number of individuals, right? So you can imagine if you have n individuals take order of n years to go extinct. When we're doing this, instead it's much, much slower, right? It's like the logarithm of 1 over n or something like that. So then it still plays a role even in the stochastic dynamics in which the endpoint is always the same. And third, again, like because we're considering very, very many species that cannot adapt to each other at all, right? So they're fixed in their interactions. Then you cannot really model evolving systems as much. So here we freeze really evolution. Even when we're doing the phenotype, people typically wrote this equation to study evolving population, but we say, no, we're only looking at ecological timescales where evolution is frozen, right? So that would be another complication.
Thank you very much. As regards this last statement, I was wondering if you have any insight or if you have any possible application of your model to paleontological data, to have this time.
They never considered. We have very good paleontologists at the University of Chicago,
Yes,
but I
know.
just never talked with them about this. It's actually an interesting problem, right? I don't know. Like it would be. I know that there's somebody like studying like diversity of trilobites, and you would think trilobites do exactly as tree. What trilobites do, right? So they can differentiate their diet and size and whatnot. but they're fundamentally the same type of bugs. So how come that we have so many species of trilobites? That could be one question. But I presented this stuff to the paleontologists several times, and no one bites. Like so I am not sure. Maybe they saw too many equations or something, and they didn't like it. But it's a good question.
Just a moment.
I have a question on so we observe. I mean, it's common in plankton ecology, not only in plankton ecology, that if you regress the diversity with the productivity of the system, you have a unimodal curve, right, with an optimal level of productivity or resources availability for diversity, and very low diversity where there are few resources or too many resources because there's an opportunist and things like that. Did you observe anything like that? I mean, I don't see in your equation
there's no resources.
Yeah, exactly. There's no resources. So what do you think could be the effect of a resource availability in, especially in the last result?
Right. I mean, one obvious effect of resource availability would be that the number of individuals that we're tracking would change, but because we're tracking on the simplex, we're only tracking the proportion. The fact that we have fewer or many more individuals doesn't show. And in fact, like, this is why this model is much more amenable to analysis compared to models in which we track the densities, right? Because we don't have this crazy thing, like if you have Lotka-Volterra models and you have, say, mutualist, they can get into this orgy of mutualism and grow to infinity, right? That's bad, right? You have dynamical instability, even though it's completely senseless, right? Because things cannot grow to infinity as far as we can tell. And here they would just be constant, right? Because we're only tracking the ratio of the two, right? So this is like one advantage of this kind of models. But it's true that then what you have to forego is like explicit resource modeling. There's nothing like that. We're only tracking phenomenologically the proportion of individuals of each kind. Yes?
I would like to ask you, can you model the spatial heterogeneity in the environment, changing the fitness of each phenotype?
Right. So when I was thinking of this, what is the probability that one beats the other being 80%? It could be in the wet season, this beats the other, but in the dry season and vice versa, so temporal variability, but you can think of any geometry. If this seed falls into a sandy soil, then this one wins, but if it's not, then the other one wins. And so you could think of spatial heterogeneity in that sense, like that there's like an heterogeneity in the environment which causes these probabilities not to be 100% and zero, but rather something in between.
Other question?
Right. I'm around all day, so
Okay.
if you have other questions, you can find me. And I'll
If
see you guys maybe this afternoon?
Yeah, this afternoon and 2:30, there will be the course about tidyverse. And it will be ending on 4:30, more or less. So
Sorry?
it's 2 hours, more or less. So after...
Till I faint, or
Yeah.
you faint, whoever comes first.
So after the course, if somebody wants to chat with him, just call him. Thank you.
Thank you.